The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 6th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Later, when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The Gospel of the Lord. So in my freshman year of college, which was a long time ago, many of us at AU were new to living in the Washington area. And so it seemed like a cool thing to do to go down to the Ellipse and watch the lighting of the National Christmas tree. And it was a cool thing to do. We got to see all the state trees that surrounded the big National Christmas tree. And at the appropriate time, President Reagan, I told you it was a long time ago, came out onto the balcony of the White House where we could stand on the Ellipse and see him way far away, and he pressed the button to light the tree. I recognized President Reagan because he was the little dot I could see on the balcony of the White House, and so it had to be him. Now, of course, after you have been in a couple of the tourist mobs on the National Mall for any reason, the appeal of going down and watching stuff kind of dims. But in January of 1993, I went down again to the mall to watch, live and in person, the first inauguration of President Clinton. Both President Clinton and President George H.W. Bush were standing there on the Capitol dais. And from my vantage point, they were dots, like President Reagan had been. But this time, I recognized them because by that point, we had jumbotrons. So I could see who they were, and I recognized their faces and watched them on TV, even as I was there live and in person. And actually, in the decades, all the decades now I have lived in the DC area, those are the only two times that I have ever seen a president live and in person, up close. And up close was far enough away that there were dots. But of course, I would always recognize any president of my lifetime because I have seen them on TV and later on social media. I've seen prints of their pictures in newspapers and campaign ads, and even though they have all been caricatured in political cartoons, the likeness is still good enough that I know who they are if I see them. But how did people recognize Jesus? The Gospel of Mark says that people saw Jesus and his disciples heading away to a deserted place, and they recognized them. But how would you do that in the first century? There were no photos of Jesus that people could view in print or online. There were no videos people could watch or see on social media. In fact, even if people had previously been nearby when Jesus performed a miracle, most of them would not have been close enough to get a very good look at him. Often, Jesus might have also been just sort of a dot in the distance, like presidents have been for me. And yet Mark says that in spite of not necessarily knowing exactly what Jesus looked like, people recognized him. In the abbreviated way that Mark tells the story, it might sound like people instantly recognized Jesus the moment they saw his face. But probably what Mark means is that as Jesus arrived in a place and started to interact with people, people were able to recognize that this was in fact the Jesus about whom they had heard so much. And even though they didn't necessarily know what Jesus looked like, they recognized Jesus by how Jesus cared for them. Mark says Jesus had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And this probably contrasted greatly from many of the famous people who came through the area and did not care at all about them, or only cared about them because they were the sheep to be fleeced. They had known a lot of folks who had come through and didn't care. But Jesus did, and that was different, and they recognized him. Probably is the case that they recognized who Jesus was, not because they knew what his face looked like, rather than because of what Jesus said to them. Mark says Jesus taught them. Instead of ignoring them or treating them like they were too dumb to understand or appreciate what God was doing in their lives. And this was, we know from other places in the gospel, the attitude of many of the Pharisees and the religious authorities at the time. Their attitude was, you couldn't understand this stuff if we began to tell you, so we're not even going to try. But Jesus sat down with them, and he taught them, and he helped them. And that's how people went, yeah, this is Jesus. We can recognize him. And even if they didn't know what Jesus' face looked like, they recognized Jesus by how he helped them with their real, everyday needs. This is a very strange gospel reading that I just read because you might have noticed that we were missing 18 verses in between the beginning and the end. Those 18 verses are Mark's version of the story of the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to read that next week in John's gospel, and then we're going to keep reading it over and over and over again. Anyway, that's for next week. But the fact is that in this context, Jesus fed people. He befriended people. He cared about people. He made sure that people understood that God didn't just care about their sort of spiritual well-being, but when they were sick, he healed them. When they were hungry, he fed them. When they were hurting, he stood with them. He cared about the actual things people needed at that moment. And that was different than a lot of other people who didn't care and said, go and be fed. Hopefully you'll be all right, but we're not going to actually help you. Jesus did all those things, and I suspect that those were really the ways that people recognized Jesus. But that raises the important question, how can people recognize Jesus in our world today? And more importantly, how is Jesus recognized in us and in our lives as Christians? It's an important question because there are sadly a lot of people out there who often give the impression that Jesus should be recognized through pure doctrine or moral codes or aloof behavior. But that was the way that the Pharisees were recognized. It was never how Jesus was recognized. Instead, Jesus wants to be recognized in us and through us by the way we show compassion for others. And it's not just because it's a nice thing to do. It is projecting the attitude that Jesus had for others, even people Jesus hadn't met and who might later have walked away and not cared much about what he said. Jesus had compassion for everybody he saw, whether they were going to accept the message or not. And sometimes compassion is shown through generosity of giving and serving, even when we're too tired and even when, like Jesus, we don't even seem to have time to eat. That's how this whole story sets up. The disciples and Jesus, they are tired, they are exhausted, they don't have time to eat. So Jesus begins by saying, let's get in a boat and go to a deserted place where we can just sit and rest. That would be a great thing. But even then, when people need it, Jesus and the disciples, they help. And sometimes the greatest show of compassion for us is when we just don't really have any time or bandwidth left. We take the time to do something to help somebody else. That is showing the kind of Jesus compassion. That's showing Jesus to others. That's helping Jesus be recognized. And for us too, we help Jesus be recognized in us and through us when we help others to understand what God is doing in their lives. And the most effective way to help people recognize that God is at work in the real world is to talk about how you personally have experienced God doing something meaningful in your life, or how God gave you strength to get through something. And this is terribly difficult because people don't like to talk about their own religious experience in front of other people or strangers, but it is just incredibly more effective to be able to do that than the people that run around and try to convince somebody else that they are too stupid to recognize God around them because they see all these things that this other person doesn't see. Jesus taught, and he did that in such a way that he helped people to recognize God in their lives. And the disciples, when they went out, they talked about how Jesus meant something to them. And that made a difference in people's lives. And often, Jesus simply wants to be recognized in our lives by the way we make God's love a tangible reality in the lives of others. I mean, much of the important work that God gives us to do doesn't always seem spiritual to some people. It can be as simple as making sure that kids get school supplies or helping people get food when they don't have any. Yet when we do those things, we do what God did in Jesus. We make his love incarnate. That is visible and tangible and a significant part of people's lives in the real world around them, not just in the next. You know, people were able to recognize Jesus even when they didn't know what he looked like. And our call as Christians is both to be people who recognize Jesus working in the world as well as to be people through whom Jesus can be recognized. And just like Jesus, we don't have to change our appearance or look in any particular way to do that. Jesus can be recognized in us whenever we treat people with compassion. Jesus can be recognized in us whenever we help others understand how God is alive and at work in our lives. And Jesus can be recognized through us whenever we, like Jesus, make God's love a tangible reality in the lives of our neighbors.